Bloomberg Audio Studios.
Podcasts, radio, news.
Andrii Shadrin is a sergeant and a medic in Ukraine's armed forces. He's on the front lines in the Donetsk region in eastern Ukraine. And in that part of the country, the fight against Russia is grinding on. He spoke to us from outside his base, and Andrii says,
that looks pretty much like World War I. Everything is covered with trenches. For sure, people are exhausted. It's not even tired. A lot of them are on their edge.
when it comes to equipment and supplies, what are you running short of? What are the things that you're not able to get in the quantity that you need?
You can never have enough equipment. You're like either short on equipment or you're deadly short on equipment.
Andrii is talking about armed vehicles and fuel, but also weapons, including some basic ones, like 155 millimeter artillery shells, which look like giant bullets. Each one weighs about 100 pounds. Also black powder, gunpowder, needed to fire those shells. Ukraine has been running short, deadly short on these. And part of the reason is that all of this was largely seen as obsolete. In an age of drones and high-tech warfare, nobody thought there would be a need for such old-school artillery and munitions.
The issues of such things as black powder would come up, but mostly as a sportsman's type angle or the need for Civil War enactors to have black powder, that sort of thing.
Bloomberg reporter Billy House says that for years, the Defense Department invested in new weapon systems, betting future conflicts would not play out the way this one has. The Pentagon wasn't predicting there'd be trench warfare in the 21st century. But Russia has relied on tanks and artillery, and it's been able to defeat many newer battlefield technologies by hacking into those systems. So Ukraine has had to meet fire with fire, or in this case, tanks with tanks. Now, the U.S. is committing billions of dollars to make more shells and black powder, to refurbish and refashion munitions factories in Pennsylvania and Louisiana and Texas. But according to Bloomberg's Roxana Tiron, this is not an easy undertaking.
A lot of these facilities, a lot of these plants are very, very old. Scranton, where I visited not long ago, it's basically a bunch of buildings from 1908.
Today on the show, new demand for old-school ammunition. The fate of Ukraine could hinge on how fast the U.S. can ramp up some of its oldest munitions plants, and if Congress signs on to that plan. This is The Big Take from Bloomberg News. I'm David Gura. To understand why the U.S. was caught off guard by Ukraine's demand for munitions, it helps to see the plants where they're made. Roxana, you go to that factory in Scranton, Pennsylvania. What does it look like, and what are they making there day in and day out?
So they make mostly 155 millimeter projectiles, and it's a very old, very dim building. It's basically a forge. It's very hot steel. They have to mold and melt into the projectiles. They have to make sure that they were forged to the right measurements. Then they have to basically cool down the steel, and you'd be surprised to find out that they go on these very rudimentary cooling racks that were used before for different industries. I think they had steam locomotives. It's a very precise process that also is kind of rudimentary because it's people in a basement that have to physically inspect tubes that come at 1,800 degrees Fahrenheit.
So, Billy, Roxana was in Scranton, Pennsylvania. You went down to Minden, Louisiana, to another munitions factory there.
It was amazing. It was as if I'd gone back decades to some barracks with rickety boards and corrugated aluminum roofs and even a tattered GoEx company flag flapping outside. It was remarkable that this is where we get our black powder, and also kind of makes you think back. Not much has probably changed since the Civil War or even before then when DuPont was the only producer of black powder. The GoEx plant in Minden is kind of the descendant of that same company. The products that go into making black powder themselves are unstable. So you have potential accidents, fires, even explosions just in storing the material. And the shipping itself is dangerous. So it's a process that is highly complicated, yet not really advanced much beyond the Civil War.
It's a throwback, but it's happening in response to what the situation on the ground calls for, and it's highlighted how much the U.S. defense industry had moved on. Roxana, what was the state of the munitions industry in the U.S. going into the war in Ukraine?
To be honest, it was fairly abysmal. The U.S. didn't spend very much money on their munitions industrial base at all. They were counting on high-profile weapons like the F-35 and other more advanced weaponry to fight future wars. And they also come out of the counterinsurgency fights in Iraq and Afghanistan, where, the wars weren't fought with bullets. But really, the war of the future that they envisioned was air power. It's hypersonic flight, it's satellites, it's aircraft that can, fly fast and dogfight and drop bombs. So this is not it. None of this happens in Ukraine at the level that they thought a future war would be fought.
It's been a rush to catch up with the old stuff. And now the question is whether you keep spending billions and billions on material and weaponry that you thought you were phasing out.
And Roxana, when we talk about the equipment, the weapons technology that's needed in Ukraine, what are we talking about exactly? What kind of munitions?
We're talking about projectiles. We're talking about 155 millimeters ammunition, sometimes even larger. But mostly it's an infantry war in Ukraine especially. And you've seen a lot of other technology such as drones and counter-drones, but a lot of it, in fact, is rudimentary. We're not talking about high technology here. We're talking about basically technology that get things done.
Sergeant Andrii Shadrin explains why those 155 millimeter shells have been and continue to be so important in Ukraine.
155 are more accurate, and we are able to reach the enemy and give a clear short shot and destroy the target in not like 15 artillery shells and in like 3 or 5 artillery shells.
He also says he and his fellow soldiers have faced some difficult choices when supplies of those munitions ran low. Most recently, when U.S. lawmakers spent months debating a military aid package.
For a long time, we were unable to call for artillery support for our unit because all the shells were for the infantry, for us not to lose positions. You're unable to call for artillery support until you're an infantry guy whose positions is assaulted. This half a year of pause when the Congress, and then we were not resupplied by the US military, that led to a shortage of artillery supplies that we pretty painfully felt throughout this half a year.
In April, Congress approved $61 billion of additional aid to Ukraine, about a fourth of which is designated for replenishing weapons stockpiles. Sergeant Shadrin welcomes that, but he acknowledges continued support from U.S. lawmakers is not a sure thing. Congress is still conflicted, not just about supporting Ukraine in its fight against Russia, but also about ramping up production in old weapons factories. How that uncertainty could shape Ukraine's military strategy after the break. This spring, lawmakers allocated billions of dollars to the Pentagon so that it can replenish its supply of munitions it's been sending to Ukraine's armed forces. President Biden touted this in a speech after he signed that aid package into law.
We're sending Ukraine equipment from our own stockpiles. Then we'll replenish those stockpiles with new products made by American companies here in America. Patriot missiles made in Arizona, Javelins made in Alabama, artillery shells made in Ohio, Pennsylvania, and Texas.
The president says he sees this effort as part of a bigger push to jumpstart American manufacturing, but there is no guarantee that funding will continue. Billy House and Roxana Tiron covered the fight over military aid to Ukraine closely. How much attention is this getting from Congress? How politically popular is this ramp up?
I'm not really seeing a wave of attention or urgency necessarily. There are predictions that Congress would need to provide another $3.5 billion a year to keep up the pace that's needed. Again, many of these lawmakers are living in a world where they thought more modern weapons would do the trick, and this has been kind of a back-in-time push to a more basic material. And it's hard to convince some of these lawmakers that that's really what you want to pour billions into, 1970s, 80s mentality type weapons.
The camps are very split, right? You have very, very strong supporters of Ukraine. And then you have, especially on the Republican side, those who did not want to give more money for the war in Ukraine. And you've seen in their own party the argument that if you build up to send munitions to Ukraine, you're actually building up the industry for the United States. And that Congress would be preparing the United States for a future conflict because they're making all of these changes to, the factory floors that would then benefit the U.S., going forward. So you've seen this argument from the minority leader, Mitch McConnell in the Senate. You've seen it from, basically all the leaders of the congressional defense committees.
Billy, I'm going to guess that in your career covering Congress, you've been to a number of hearings about some of that high-tech weaponry, the F-35 and the like. Was there a moment at which you noticed that lawmakers were waking up to the idea that the weapons that were needed for these two wars weren't aligned with what they've been prioritizing?
Not really. Only recently, and during the Ukraine war, did you start to see people float proposed legislation to correct the inadequacies they've determined.
And they realized that they couldn't produce the amounts that Ukraine was even spending in 1 month. I mean, they started out at 14,000 155 millimeter projectiles a month. And their aim is to get to 100,000 a month by the end of 2025.
Roxana, as all of this work is underway to replenish this stockpile, takes time, as you've laid out. What's happening on a more kind of short-term basis?
The U.S. has obviously ramped up production. In Scranton, they have 3 shifts, 7 days a week. So they hired more people. You now have about 300 people working in Scranton, which, by the way, also has a minimum wage of $7.25. And General Dynamics, the plant, they pay a lot more. So it is definitely a coveted place to work. They also opened up a new facility in Texas, in Mesquite, Texas, the rodeo capital of the U.S., and they have another factory in Canada, actually, that would also make the steel casings. In the meantime, they've also ramped up work in Iowa, where they do the explosive fill. And they're also very soon will be opening more facilities, one in Arkansas and one in Kansas. And they have gotten to a point where now they are producing about 35,000 155 millimeter projectiles a month. And they're ramping up quickly, and they're expecting to get about 68,000 very early next year, and then finally go up to 100,000 by the end of 2025. But what it takes, though, it takes a lot of congressional attention, and it takes a lot of money. We're talking about at least $5 billion to make all of these improvements, to buy some of this munition. But in the long term, they will still need a lot of congressional dedication and attention to be able to keep producing these munitions at a rapid pace and to keep buying them.
If Congress doesn't keep approving the money for this, these weapons will dry up. Is it a challenge for U.S. allies?
It is definitely. In Europe, in particular, they're dealing with the same kind of problems that the U.S. is dealing with, perhaps even more. They're trying to ramp up their production of 155 millimeters and other type of projectiles as well. And they're finding that, they did not invest in defense infrastructure. And they're finding that building up is really difficult and it takes time.
What does the Pentagon make of the way these wars are being waged and sort of what it might mean for warfare in the future?
I think they realize that it does take a lot of bullets. And it also, this is not to say that they are completely turning away from high-tech weaponry. That's absolutely not the case. But they're using Ukraine as a case study to build up the munitions industrial base, not only to build these projectiles, but also to move faster when it comes to precision-guided munitions, bunker busters, the kinds of things that the U.S. might use in a much larger conflict. So I think it's taught the United States a lesson that it kind of needs to be prepared for all instances, for all types of war, and not just react to the war in front of them.
In the meantime, as the U.S. grapples with this reality, on the front lines in Ukraine, Sergeant Andrii Shadrin says the stakes of getting much-needed munitions are high, not just for him and other troops, but also for all of Europe, and arguably for the whole Western world.
We're fighting the country that is 3 times larger than us by population. Their military budget is something like, dozens of times larger than our was. If you're supporting the humanitarian ideas, if you want this war stopped, it's pretty easy to stop it. Give us the enough amount of instruments to stop it, to stop Russians, to reclaim our territory. That is investment in a future peace on European continent.
This is The Big Take from Bloomberg News. I'm David Gura. This episode was produced by Jessica Beck and Alex Segura. It was edited by Stacey Vanek Smith, Tim Annette, and Megan Scully. It was mixed by Veronica Rodriguez. It was fact-checked by Thomas Liu. Our senior producers are Naomi Shavin and Kim Gittleson. Our senior editor is Elizabeth Ponso. Nicole Beamster-Bohr is our executive producer. Sage Bauman is Bloomberg's head of podcasts. If you like this episode, make sure you subscribe and review The Big Take wherever you get your podcasts. It helps new listeners find the show. Thanks for listening. We'll be back next week.